Signore e signori, buonasera. Benvenuti alla Casa Italiana Zerilli-Marimò della New York University. I'm Stefano Albertini, I'm the director of the Casa. It's a great pleasure for me tonight to host this presentation of two books by Iris Origo that have been recently published by the New York Review Books Classics. And while we are at it, I'd just remind you that on October 3rd, we are going to present the English translation of Curzio Malaparte's Kremlin Ball in this very same room. And I would like to take this chance to thank the imprint of the New York Review Book Classics for what they're doing for translations, but also for the publication of books that are relevant to Italian culture, very much like the two ones that we're reading tonight. And on top of a celebration of these American editions, it's also for us a chance to pay homage to an extraordinary woman, an adoptive Italian that made Italy her country, and that showed in times of great need when you can become from a simple spectator to an active protagonist that has an impact in the life of so many people. So this is particularly important for me to underline. And without further ado, I would like to introduce to you my colleague Rebecca Falkoff, who is the moderator for this evening, and thank her for the work that she put into the preparation of this presentation. Rebecca is a professor of Italian studies here at New York University, and she specializes in contemporary Italian literature, and particularly women writers. She's completing her book on hoarding, and she wrote also about other topics, including Gadda and Elena Ferrante and many other things. And it's a pleasure to work with Rebecca and to find her smiling and say yes to anything I propose her to do for the Casa. And in turn, Rebecca will introduce her panel. Please welcome Rebecca Falkoff.
Thank you, Stefano. Good evening. Thank you all for coming and making your way through the chilly, damp air. It's a pleasure to be here this evening to talk about these two diaries by Iris Origo. And it's an honor to introduce our three distinguished guests this evening. Marisa Escolar is an assistant professor of Italian at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Her research focuses on post-unification Italian literature and culture, with an emphasis on fascism, World War II, and encounters with the Anglo-American world. Her book, Allied Encounters, forthcoming in 2019 with Fordham University Press, is the first monograph in English or Italian on cultural representations of the Allied Italian encounter. And I think, actually, I know this work really changes critical narratives of World War II literature by attending to the intersections of race and gender in Anglo-American and Italian diaries, military guidebooks, novels, and film. Ben Downing is co-editor of the literary journal Parnassus and a regular book reviewer for the Wall Street Journal. He's the author of The Queen Bee of Tuscany, the redoubtable Janet Ross, a biography of the English historian and biographer who spent most of her life in Florence, and who knew the young Iris Origo and whose career would substantially parallel her own. And Katia Lysy was born in Rome and has worked in publishing as a journalist and as a literary translator. She now lives in Val d'Orcia in southern Tuscany, where she assists her mother, Benedetta, who's also here this evening, who is the daughter of Iris Origo, in the management and development of the family estate of La Foce, whose historic gardens are visited by Origo readers from all over the world. So please join me in welcoming our guest. So the books we'll be discussing this evening are A Chill in the Air, an Italian war diary from 1939 to 1940. Oh, sorry. The books we're discussing this evening are A Chill in the Air, an Italian war diary 1939 to 1940, and War in Valdorcia, an Italian war diary from 1943 to 1944. In these diaries, Origo is an astute observer not only of what is happening around her, but also of how she and everyone else around her piece together conflicting accounts from conflicting sources. Origo's diaries give us a narrative and a meta-narrative, anticipating the anxious attention constantly required of us today as we navigate the proliferation of truths and attempt to understand where they come from and where they're leading us. Origo writes from a unique vantage point as an aristocratic Anglo-American landowner married to an Italian. She was clearly exceptional, but in some ways she was very much a product of the expatriate milieu that Ben has written about brilliantly in The Queen Bee of Tuscany. And so Ben, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that milieu and about how their lives were parallel.
Sure, yeah. So how's this? Can people hear me okay?
Yeah.
Is it good? Louder? Is this like that? Is that better? Okay. Roughly from the 1840s, for about a century afterwards, there was something that came to be quasi-officially known as the Anglo-Florentine colony. There was as many as 30,000 Brits, as well as Americans living in Florence around 1910, which is when the year before Iris showed up in Florence in the towed along by her rather eccentric mother, who had been widowed not long before. And so Iris was, what, 9? I think a 9-year-old at this point, and was suddenly thrust into this kind of hothouse world of, people like Bernard Berenson, and the woman I wrote about, Janet Ross, was a neighbor of Bernard Berenson's, and so sort of grew up among these art historians and writers and merely rich people in some cases. So until she, I can't remember exactly when she left, but by the time she became an adult, she was essentially a little Anglo-Florentine, you might say, in a way. But then she went in quite a different direction. So maybe I should leave it there.
Yeah, I'd love to hear about that different direction, and if you could talk a little bit about La Foce.
Yes, I have some photographs which are probably best to illustrate. Okay, so this is Iris Origo. She would have been it's just a few years before she wrote the book that will be presented here today, A Chill in the Air, which is a sort of a prequel of her best-known work, War in Valdorcia. War in Valdorcia tells of the passage of war in this small rural community and how it affects, how it turns this war completely creates an upheaval in the small rural community. Whereas A Chill in the Air is a diary about the atmosphere in Italy just before the beginning of the war. And she is an Anglo-American, married to an Italian, whose godfather is the American ambassador in Rome, who also lives on an estate in Tuscany where a great deal of social work and agricultural work was being carried out. She has access to so many different voices, to so many different points of view. And most of all, of course, what we connect with now is how she has this very piercing gaze on the false proclamations of Mussolini's regime. So it's also a war diary about war propaganda. And we cannot but think of the similarities to the present day and what we call fake news. So that's very interesting. Of course, it's the radio that plays a big role here, while we are used to thinking of the internet as prevailing. But anyway, I'm going slightly off track. So this is what she looked like in the period of, can I?
Yeah,
Thank you. But this is her in 1907. So why 1907? Because this was a crucial year for her. Her American father, very rich American father, died, and as a dying wish asked his eccentric mother, who you were talking about, his eccentric wife, Sybil Cutting, to bring Iris up somewhere where she cannot belong, where she will not belong, so she'll be free of all this national feeling that causes so many problems. So obviously, the consequence was that my grandmother never really felt at home anywhere, but she did receive a very cosmopolitan upbringing. And he expressed a wish for her to be brought up in Italy. They chose Florence. Her mother brought her to Florence and bought the wonderful Villa Medici, which maybe Ben wants to say something about because it features very much in the
Anglo-Florentine
colony. It's next door to Bernard Berenson.
I don't know that much about what went on there. I know there were parties, and it was part of a circuit of society homes, you might say, where again, I did try to go there and saw it from a distance, but I didn't get to see the interior. What's the state of it now? It's
beautifully maintained by the present owner.
Okay,
it's beautifully maintained. And Cecil Pinsent is the author of The Garden. Now, Cecil Pinsent is also the architect, the British architect who designed the gardens at La Foce, which is, we'll get to there. So we were saying that Iris Origo was part of this Anglo-Florentine community and very, very closed, very intellectual, usually not very much in touch with the Italian world. Janet Ross was possibly more of an exception, but the average Anglo-Florentine did not communicate with the Italians much. Iris Origo certainly had a desire to break free from this ivory tower. And one of the main reasons why she actually did make a totally different choice in her life was that she met an Italian nobleman called Antonio Origo, 10 years her senior, who she fell in love with, had to have a long engagement with her because her mother very much disapproved. She wasn't always very nice to her daughter, and she said, first of all, he's too old for you, and secondly, he's too handsome. So, nice thing to hear your mother say. So here she is on her wedding day. Sybil Cutting was taken ill on the day of the wedding and did not attend. So there was I don't know if you know the joke about her in the Anglo-Florentine.
She fainted a lot.
She fainted a lot. Yeah. Can you hear me properly? Because I don't know if the... Okay. So she fainted a lot, and an unkind friend once said, oh, Sybil's sick again, she's ill again. Well, I wonder what bug does she have? Could it be the humbug? Anyway, here she is, ready to beautifully set off on her marriage, her honeymoon with Antonio. And where are they going to? This desolate, bleak valley. Why? In 1924, the Origos bought a huge estate in the very desolate, very poor Val d'Orcia. There was a variety of reasons for their choices. They wanted to make a difference. They wanted to change people's lives for the better. My grandfather had a very strong agricultural interest, so the idea was to reclaim this land where nothing grew. And my grandmother was very, very interested in social improvements. So really just through agriculture, improving the lot of these very, very poor people, bringing schools, bringing roads, bringing education, bringing health services. So just to give you an idea, this is the Val d'Orcia, south of Florence, in the 1920s, and this is the Val d'Orcia today. So a big change. And this is the sort of work that they had to undertake. There was a certain amount of help from Mussolini's regime because their project coincided with the fascist policy of sustaining agriculture in the hopes that Italy would become independent agriculturally, etc. So they did get a certain amount of subsidies, but a lot came out of their own pockets. And a lot was possible just because there was so much labor. These people are removing stones by hand with little wheelbarrows and nothing else. It's very, very terribly bad land, only clay and stones. Look at that. Wow. Wonderful photographs, all luckily made by my grandfather because there was nobody else around to document these changes. We wouldn't have a great deal of documentation if it hadn't been for him. For the first harvest, you can still see the clay hills and the part that have been reclaimed. This was an old farmhouse. One of the big shocks to my grandmother was when she arrived, she said she saw that these people were living in really conditions of such dire poverty that in one case, she visited a farmhouse where on the only bed, the grandfather was dying and his granddaughter was giving birth in the same bed. So one of the priorities was to rebuild the farmhouses, designed also by Cecil Pinsent. He designed practically everything that went on at La Foce. And this is the model farmhouse that they were dreaming of and that in fact was realized. So we're talking about some 50 farms which were reconstructed and rebuilt. The pigsty is separate from the house, though the animals continue to be on the lower floor, the stables are on the lower floor. The manure pit is also separate from the house in the first. So that's taken from a fresco. This is one of the new farmhouses built from the late 1920s on. And then the school education was a priority for her. This is the school bus. So she had the idea of taking the children away from the fields where they were accompanying their parents because they didn't have anywhere else to leave them. Bringing them to a school, to making a school, a special school with a special non-fascist program, which meant it was very different from the fascist program. And these were the lucky children who were brought to school with a school horse, carriage and horse. But the unlucky ones, the ones who really lived in out-of-the-way places, had to make do with the oxen. Must have been very, very slow going. The vaccination program. So all this is happening in the 1920s and 1930s. This is an interesting example of how Pinsent was influenced very much in the Garden of La Foce, but also the idea of the landscape as a garden, enclosing the garden. When this very famous road, which has since become an icon of Tuscany, was planned, it was planned with the purpose of reaching one of the farmhouses, so it was functional. But it also was inspired by the aesthetic of the Florentine and Sienese painters of the 14th and 15th century. So it had to be like, for example, the Cappella dei Magi fresco. Nowadays, people just think it's very picturesque, but those actually had a philosophy behind it. So this is Gianni, her and Antonio's son. This is the reason why she began writing. She'd always written all through her childhood, but never with a view to really publishing and becoming a serious author. In 1933, her 7-year-old child died of tubercular meningitis. The very same thing, tragic coincidence, had happened to her with her father. Her father died of tuberculosis when she was 7, so it was like a nightmare repeated. In order to really escape from the constant thought of Gianni, she spent a lot of time in those years from 1933 to 1937 in London, where she met a lot of interesting people, including Virginia Woolf, and started to write seriously, really to take her thoughts off Gianni. She met many people who she later would refer to also in A Chill in the Air, pacifists like Max Plowman. She took part in the Kindertransport scheme. It wasn't quite the Kindertransport scheme because she acted as a separate donor, and she saved 3 Jewish children, and one of them turned out to be, by a very happy coincidence, Frank Auerbach, who's a very famous painter, possibly one of England's most famous painters. He's now English. Anyway, she, at a certain point, she kept coming back to La Foce. She kept coming back to her Italian husband. And La Foce was such a big project for her. And as time went on, she found she could go back without the memories of Gianni being too strong. And in 1938, she actually found herself having to make a definite choice. She gave up her American passport, otherwise she could not have stayed on in Italy, and she became Italian. She chose her husband's country. But she continues, of course, to look at the events that are unfolding around her with a very critical eye. This is the building of La Foce, which goes on. There's a lot about this, but we can do that later. So she starts to write A Chill in the Air. Before that, she had written, she had begun on what is her favorite field, really. It's just biography and social history. We were looking at La Foce. I just wanted to show you some pictures of the garden. This is Antonio and my mother, who's in the audience, the eldest child, who features in War in Valdorcia. These are the refugee children. I don't know whether about War in Valdorcia, Marisa wants to talk a bit more about that, because it's really more your field as a historian of the Second World War. But these are the refugee children who were taken in at La Foce, at the Origo estate, to provide safety for children from the country, from the cities that were being bombed, especially Genoa and Turin, right at the beginning of the war. They were very much, they are in fact maybe the main characters in her war diary, War in Valdorcia. Here we are, the partisans. These were the local partisans. I think you can say maybe something about the role that the Origos had in the war, as it's told in War in Valdorcia.
Absolutely. I mean, maybe when we start talking about the diary a little bit more fully, I think that the images that you have of the refugee children and the partisans really highlight unique aspects of her diary, because we don't really have a lot of narratives that talk about refugee children, and that particularly that discuss them on such intimate terms, what they've eaten, how they dress, that capture their voices. And there is a very wide body of partisan narrative, but not in Tuscany quite so much. And so this is a very unique perspective. And the dominant narrative that was happening in Italy after the war was really the heroic partisan. And looking at Origo's depiction of the partisans in a passage that I'll read maybe later on if we have time, she really shows a much more complex heroic
Much more
partisans,
complex
but also
reality.
selfish partisans, also violent
All
partisans,
kinds.
all human partisans.
Human nature, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is the sign, the Kinderheim La Foce, the sign they put up when they escaped with all the children from under the Allied bombs. They found refuge in the nearby town of Montepulciano. They put this sign on the door in an attempt to dissuade the Germans from bothering them, saying, this is, you know, there are children here. Here she is in the 1940s. Here's the La Foce garden as it still is today. In Cecil Pinson's fresco when it was completed, and this is a fresco dated 1941. And this is the overall view. All the houses around were very, very much a part of the estate. What my grandparents were very intent on not doing was to reproduce the old order of the landlord in his villa and the peasants in their various little houses. So everything had to congregate around the villa. So all the agricultural activities, from olive oil pressing to the grape picking to storing the grain, bottling plant, everything happened around. So this created a feeling of a community, a feeling which was very much intensified during the Second World War, when La Foce became an almost self-contained little world, but not a selfish world. It was a world where everybody received help, everybody who asked. And it wasn't just the partisans, the refugees from the towns, the escaped Allied prisoners of war. It would also be the boys escaping from the fascist army to get back home. Everybody was, if they asked for help, they got it. This is my mother, homage to my mother, who's in the audience. And this is the reason why La Foce still looks as it does today in these photographs. So thank you very much.
Marisa, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about what was happening more broadly between 1939 and 1940 and 1943 and 1944, and how her story fits into it.
Absolutely. So as a literary scholar, I always like to preface any historical discussion with the disclaimer that I'm not a historian. But just to give some context to the books, so the first diary, as we see, starts in 1939, March 1939. This is really the tail end of the fascist regime. People are increasingly waking up to the dangers of fascism after the invasion of Ethiopia, the enactment of the racial laws. 1938 was really a turning point. But the diary starts with the celebration of the 20th anniversary of the founding of the Fasci, and Origo finds herself on a train with 1,000 celebrating men, and the celebration doesn't seem quite as charged as it might be, but there it is. And that diary moves us step by step closer to war. So we see Italy occupying Albania in April, and of course Germany's occupation of Poland, what we call now the start of World War II. And then it ends after Italy has declared war in June 1940. So the diary is sort of remarkable for the suspense that it builds up to this event that we all know is going to happen. And at each pass, is it possible that maybe it's not going to happen? And she chronicles, each sort of opinion as it breaks towards maybe it will happen, maybe it won't happen. And then we have a good 2.5-year break. And now it's January of 1943. So the U.S. is firmly in the war. They've gotten to North Africa. The tides are really turning against Italy, and the Allies are able to start conducting air raids on Italy, which is what precipitates the refugee crisis and is the the start of the second diary. So the second diary also starts with a journey, and it's the journey of the refugee children to La Foce. And then the diary takes us through all the main events of the occupation. So the Allied landing in Sicily in July of 1943, the fall of Mussolini, the tense negotiations leading up to the armistice, the surprise announcement of the armistice, which is being portrayed as a step towards peace, but of course, Origo knows that it really just means the continuation of war. It's one of her many astute observations. And then, things proceed quickly at first, the liberation of Naples, and then the bulk of the diary really gives the sense of just the excruciatingly slow movement of the Allies northward up the peninsula from Naples to Rome, which took all the way till June of that year. And then there's one more month before they reach her. And so we end in July of 1944. So there's it doesn't get quite to the end of the war. There's still some more to go. And she leaves us with this sort of hopeful note of renewal at the end.
Is it are the topoi that you encounter in this text similar to ones that you've seen in war writings about Naples or Rome or other Tuscan, if the few Tuscan works there are?
So really the only way you can describe Origo is unique, which is not a very helpful word maybe, but it's true. There were not many Anglo-American women in Rome, in Italy at the time. I know of only one other woman who was actually in the Vatican writing a diary at the same time. So the fact that she was there writing this, that makes her unique. Just to start, that she had this sort of long perspective. So the Americans that arrived, that wrote some of the more famous war narratives, they arrived with the armistice, with the landing in Naples, and their narratives really kind of start very abruptly, October 1st or June 4th. She's got this much bigger picture that really changes things. I think, as Katia, as you said, the extent of her connections, just so many different kinds of people whose voices she all includes in the diaries makes her unique. So she's talking to Germans, she's talking to American diplomats, she's talking to partisans, she's talking to children, she's talking to her peasants. She has letters from her friends of all sorts of different political beliefs. She quotes them extensively, so the diary also preserves those narratives. So that's something that makes her unique. As well as her position in Tuscany, and southern Tuscany, which was really a crossroads in our studies of the cultural production of World War II. There's a lot more emphasis given to southern Italy, which is where the Allies were for the longer period of time, so there's just more kind of going on. And then when we look at the partisan narratives, we really focus on the north, which is where the most famous partisan narratives came from. And she shows us something in between that isn't either one of those things, but sort of pertains to both. So I think it's important in that way as well.
I was wondering about what made you decide to publish A Chill in the Air now. Is this a text that you always knew about, or discovered in the attic, or how did this happen?
It was discovered in the attic, really, but not really by me. It was rediscovered because this, just like War in Valdorcia, was not written originally for publication. The idea was to leave her daughters an account of what had really happened in the case that she should be taken away by the Germans. She slept with a small suitcase under her bed. She hid her war diaries, knowing my grandmother, I'm probably not very well most of the time. She was quite distracted. But anyway, she says that sometimes she buried them, and sometimes she hid them in among the children's book in the library at La Foce. Anyway, she did not mean for War in Valdorcia to be published. Right at the end of the war, she had a lot of very influential people, friends and relatives in England who were reading it and who said, you have to have this published because it has to show the other face of Italy, not just Mussolini's side. And it's very important that Italy should. So she was convinced to do that, and it turned out to be a fantastic success, etc. This is just like she kept a war diary for war in Valdorcia, she kept a diary before the war. In later life, she was persuaded to reread it with a view to publishing it. Certainly her biographer, Caroline Moorhead, read it and quotes from it. And my uncle, the husband of her second daughter, Donata, was also interested in publishing it. Unfortunately, by that time, she was not very well. She was getting old, and she really didn't have the energy to complete a revision. So it's sort of the manuscript, or rather typescript, luckily, languished in the attic for a long time. And then I reread it, and I thought, this is so interesting. We have to. This is a real completion of War in Valdorcia, even though it's a prequel.
And is she telling the same stories that you heard from her growing up, or were you always? Does she have another perspective on the war that she told to her family? Did she talk about the war a lot? Is there any difference there?
I think it's as if the war for her was an ongoing project, in the sense that she and my grandfather and my mother tells me this mostly, that they, in a way, thought that the war had been an important moment for La Foce because it brought out this sense of solidarity that I was talking about before. The community really drew close to each other. And also because after the war, Italy went through a series of major changes, really major economic, social. For the farming community, for the agricultural community, there was the end of the feudal, dating back to feudal times, the mezzadria, which is a very complicated system and has its good sides and bad sides, but definitely was something that had to be ended. So there was so many changes that almost in comparison, the world of the war was easy to understand. There was good and there was bad, despite all the various complications of human nature. But it was harder afterwards from their point of view. It was harder to understand what was going on. So in the way that she did not give up the La Foce project, for example, all the refugee children who had found shelter at La Foce later became, not them, but their successors, became the inhabitants of the same house, the same school that housed the refugee children, as part of a small orphanage is not the right word, because she had very much ahead of her time already. She had the idea of an extended family of not more than 10 to 12 children who would be taken in, educated, and in the attempt to find foster families. And many of them came to the States because she had many connections in the United States. She found families for them in the United States. So she would often talk about the war, but also about what went on after the war and the continuation. And we constantly have people, there's somebody here in the audience, whose father had a marginal contact with my grandmother, but a very important one for him, and beautifully told. People who, found assistance at La Foce during the war and afterwards came back or wrote, or their children did, to say thank you. It was very much something that continued.
Maybe we could hear some of the text itself. Ben, I know you had a passage that you were.
I could read.
That would be great. Okay.
A couple short.
Okay. Yeah, that would be great.
But just to say a few quick words, about these about these books just as pieces of writing. I'd read War in Valdorce many years ago, and just reread it, kind of skimmed it admittedly this past week, and then read the new memoir, and they're so well written. They're without ever being without ever being self-conscious in any way. They're just clear as a bell, and often with with a certain humor to them at moments too. So actually, I've picked a couple of moments passages that I think are typify part of the book, and this is I'm going to stick to War in Valdorce, but part of the excitement of the book in a way is that every day is a different day, and Iris and Antonio would come downstairs or walk around the farms, and there would be partisans in the bushes and POWs wandering through, and children, and Germans demanding things, and it's almost like a French farce at moments. There's
yes, yeah, you wonder how, yeah.
And they have to make these flash decisions about how to handle all these competing demands that at some risk to their lives and to the lives of the people around them. But she somehow manages at night to go home and write these crystalline diary entries. So I thought I'd read a couple short ones about some of the kind of daily encounters that she would have, and she and Antonio both would have, just walking outside the door, really, and not knowing what the day was going to bring. Let me see. One speaking of the partisans, one passage. Look here is. Oh, and then I should say that people would kind of word spread around about the Origos, almost sort of like maybe among tramps during the Great Depression in the United States. Go to this place for help, and so people would sometimes just show up at the door asking for things or demanding things because there was sort of a grapevine of information about them. So this is March 30th. 44. We continue to have many self-invited guests. This morning, I met 2 American prisoners just outside the house. And this afternoon, walking up our private wood path to the chapel, Antonio heard some rustling in the bushes and found a party of 15 men armed with a Tommy gun and muskets, and 3 of them wearing the communist red star, lying in wait, they said, quote, for anyone who comes to make trouble. Antonio had an amicable conversation with them, suggesting that it is better to avoid unnecessary bloodshed, and then left them there. So, and I'll just read one more. That one has I think a slightly comic flavor, but some of these passages are really heartrending to read about. Sometimes the people that she can't help. And so this is the entirety of her entry for one day. 2 other fugitives turn up, an old Jew from Siena and his son. Both of them, clad in the most unsuitable of town clothes and thin shoes, are shivering with cold and terror. The father, the owner of an antique shop, produces from an inner pocket, drawing me aside, a little carved ivory Renaissance figure, which he wishes to exchange for food and warm clothing. We supply the latter and suggest that he should keep the figure for future needs. He and his son wish to walk through the German lines to Naples, and to all our dissuasions, since it is clear that the old man, who suffers from heart disease, will die upon the way, they only reply, we have no choice, we must. After a rest and some food, they start up the hill in the snow, the old man groaning a little as he leans on his son's shoulder. So, yeah. Good enough, right?
Yeah.
Oh.
Me?
Yeah.
So I wonder if she was sort of willfully evoking the narrative of Aeneas. Oh, sorry. I wonder if she was drawing on Aeneas.
I mean, she did have that classical education. I don't know if she even,
Maybe
I haven't even thought of that. But of course, you're right. Yeah, it does recall Aeneas and Kaisa.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Marisa, will you read us something?
Yeah, so when I had the chance to reread the book this time, a passage really jumped out at me, which is this really dramatic scene of some partisans who are ganging up on a fascist and want to kill him, and they're on the property and they have to figure out what to do. I think if this ever got made into a film, this should be a central episode. Okay, so as we were weeding the garden, the gardener comes running up. The partisans are killing a fascist. He is taking refuge in the clinic with his wife and baby. We go down there and find a group of about 15 partisans in picturesque garments and very much overarmed, surrounding the clinic from which they had turned out the patients and children. Antonio goes up to their leader, who chooses to call himself Uragano, hurricane, and asks what it is all about. Apparently a fascist, in uniform and belonging to the SS, who was on his way back from Rome, had got a lift with his brother, wife, and a small baby on a German lorry as far as the main road, and had then attempted to walk across our valley to Chianciano, wheeling the pram with their luggage. Just below the clinic, however, 3 partisans came out of the wood and demanded the fascist's pistol. His brother threw himself upon the partisan, and after a struggle, disarmed him. The 3 then ran to call their comrades, who were resting in a farm nearby, while the fascists, with the woman and baby, took refuge indoors. Other partisans then appeared, surrounded the house, and were exchanging threats with the fascists out of the window, until Uragano appeared and tried to calm them down. Antonio points out the idiocy of the whole performance and tries to persuade them to release the man after disarming him. This most of them are prepared to do, but 2 or 3 are sullen. It's all very fine, they say, but they would show us no mercy if they had us in their hands. Meanwhile, I go indoors and find the woman in hysterics and the baby, only 1 month old, howling while its father was changing its diapers. Take them upstairs and give them some coffee while outside an interminable argument goes on. Some of the men want the fascist's life, some only his badges, others want to take him as a hostage. One of the rebels says he wants the personal satisfaction of cutting off the badges and goes indoors. Uragano goes up with him, I follow, and we find the ferocious fascist rocking his baby in his arms. He docilely removes the badges with his nail scissors, and the partisan explains that he has joined the Patriots in order to avenge his brother who had been killed by the fascists. Then, quite amicably, he goes off with the badges, and outside, the argument begins again. At last, Uragano's men give way, and the whole party, in our pony cart and minus their shoes, which had been taken by the partisans, is allowed to set off for Chianciano. So I picked that passage. I mean, I think you can see why, but the docile fascist holding his, rocking his baby in his arms is really, we don't have that character quite so often, and you really see this pacifist, effort to diffuse the sort of impossible conflict and the humanity behind all of it.
I think that we probably have time for questions unless you want to add to, or.
I'm fine.
Okay. Okay. So I think we can take some questions from the audience. I'm sure you're a lot to ask about. Does anyone?
This is just a little bit of a sidetrack, but you mentioned that the grandmother's biographer was Caroline Moorhead, which reminded me that she also did a biography of the great American war correspondent Martin Gellhorn, who also adopted a child out of Italian orphanage and had very personal journalism in the sense of what I'm hearing in these passages. I was just curious if those 2 formidable women ever met.
They did meet, didn't they? I'm asking my mother if she would know, probably. What was Iris Origo's relationship with Martha Gellhorn?
They were very good friends.
And I think we should also welcome her with an applause.
Thank you. if that was meant for me, which I don't think I deserve, but thank you. Yes, Martha Gellhorn was a very close friend of my mother's. They corresponded a lot, and she did come to La Foce, and they talked a lot about books and about literature and their past, I suppose. There's quite a long correspondence with Martha Gellhorn, of which, unfortunately, only a couple of letters have remained. My mother destroyed a lot of her correspondence with even wonderful people, Isaiah Berlin, Virginia Woolf, so many interesting people. And well, at the time, when you wrote a letter, you really sat down and wrote a long letter, and it meant something to you and to the person who was receiving it. So, unfortunately, she had the habit of really throwing letters into the fire once she'd answered them. She never hoarded anything. She never gave any importance to keeping things. It was all in her mind. She had a fantastic memory.
I find it very surprising that the Germans never touched you between 1943-44, after the Italian collapse. The Germans did not bother you or came, or did they? Massati would be surprised if they did not, if they had not.
They did.
Yeah. And what happened?
Well, what happened was that they were turned out of La Foce at the worst possible moment, with the 28 refugee children entrusted to their care, and several of the farmers, they had all congregated in the cellars of La Foce. La Foce was taken over by, first by the army and then by SS paratroopers, who were in really, apparently, left the house in terrible conditions and were really totally drugged, etc. And at a certain point, they were told that it would be safe for them to stay with all these children. Where could they go? But they would have to stay in the cellars. Then at a certain point, they said, no, you have to go away. Just go away quickly, quickly. There's a lull in the fighting. And of course, there wasn't really. So with these children, they escaped. This is June 1944. So they escaped across the fields, under the bombs, hiding in the ditches, desperately trying to get to safety. And in fact, when they got to Montepulciano, just a few days later, the British troops came in. So in fact, they were lucky to wait for so long, but there was a long period in which the Germans were advancing so slowly that one didn't really know when it would become too difficult to stay on. Certainly, long before that, my grandmother and La Foce in general, but especially my grandmother, had been signaled as potential spies. Well, the spies, I mean, yeah, potential link in the network of the resistance, because as I said, she slept with a suitcase under her bed, and there had been articles in the fascist newspapers saying, this rich American living there in safety, shielded by her Italian husband, what is she still doing there? So, yes, it must have been a very tense situation, yeah.
I thought your afterword in A Chill in the Air was so particularly fascinating because even in reading Carolyn Moorhead's biography and her own autobiography, she doesn't reveal a lot of personal details about herself. And you really talked about what she was like as a person, as a grandmother, how she felt about Gianni. Could you talk a little bit about that?
one of the things that everybody notices in War in Valdorcia and especially in A Chill in the Air is the absence of any reference to her private life. In A Chill in the Air, it's almost surreal because at a certain point she says, my godfather, the American pastor, says that Rome is not the ideal place for an accouchement. And you think, oh my goodness, all this is going on, and she is about to have her eldest daughter, who's in fact Benedetta. And in fact, it's the reason why abruptly she ends the Diary of A Chill in the Air. In the same way, in War in Valdorcia, my grandfather is very rarely mentioned, though he evidently was a central figure along with her. The reason was that she was a very private person, and she sort of believed very much in an impartial observation. She didn't like to talk about her private life. But of course, she was a very affectionate grandmother and mother. So I luckily saw that side of her. I could say more than Caroline Moorhead on that matter.
Early on in A Chill in the Air, excuse me, I seem to recall a passage about your grandfather going off as an officer.
Being called up in the reserve,
yes, and came back, but there wasn't much said about it. Could you amplify that or add to it?
I think he was just too old to take part. I'll check with my mother there, but he had taken part in the First World War. At the age of 19, he won a silver medal for bravery, which is like really gold medals go only to people who are dead. He was, oh really? So this silver medal was, he was 19, very young, never ever spoke about the First World War, but had nightmares about it apparently, says my grandmother. I think he was just, Mussolini called up some reserve officers. He was, what age was he? He was, by the standards of the time, he was old to take part in the war. He was 40.
He was born
in
1891.
Oh, 1891, that's right. So 50.
So he was...
No, yes. So he never actively took part in the war, the Second World War. She's the person I was referring to.
Which has to do with, which connects with my mother's history and is also in the book.
Yes. So my father is he's not one of the passages you read about, but he was one of the POWs who escaped from German custody. He had invaded Italy with General Patton and was ultimately captured. And in one of the passages in Iris's book, a train is blown off a bridge nearby in Alarona by the Americans, who were unaware that it contained American POWs. And half the people were killed, but he managed to escape and made his way to La Foce with really bad plans, just like the Jewish father and son that you write about. He planned to keep walking north until he got to the sea and was going to steal a boat. And she said to him, that's just a terrible idea, because the further north you go, you're going to find less food, more Germans, plus the Allies are advancing this way. And because he had been in prison camp for several months and had had no news of the war, he really didn't know which way to go. So he always credited Iris with saving his life by turning him around. They dyed his uniforms at one of the farms and turned him around and said, go back south a little bit and find a friendly family and just hide there until the front passes, which 6 months later it did. So I hope she didn't, they wrote back and forth after the book was published in America in 1984, and I can't find her letters either, even though I hope he didn't throw them in the fireplace, but I wish I could now. So he was just one of the many people whose lives, she saved, so.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This was a really, really interesting talk. I'm curious about the some of the other works that Iris Origo has written and how these two kind of, autobiographical, these two diaries fit in with that. We know that she was clearly had a sense of the literary. She was interested in history and biography. And so I'm curious, and I wonder if one or more of you could speak a little bit about that, about the rest of her corpus and how these two pieces fit into that. Or maybe not, so I don't know.
No, her main interest was, in fact, as a biographer. She had this gift of bringing people to life. She really was wonderful at portraits of people. And the New York book classic series is going to come out with other works by her, including her biography of Leopardi, the poet, the Italian poet, who was very little known at the time to the English-speaking public. It's a lovely book, very, very interesting, very vivid description. And The Last Attachment is the name of her account of Byron's last passionate love affair with Teresa Guiccioli. That's also going to be published. She wrote about San Bernardino, a medieval monk who was a fascinating figure in Tuscan religious literature. She wrote a lot about several aspects of medieval life, and maybe one of her best known works is The Merchant of Prato, which is the story of a medieval merchant whose letters survived with letters his wife to his partners, and they give a very complete picture of that aspect of medieval life and commerce and family matters. So yes, she was her main interest really was biography. She wrote a series of essays on biography as well. So did you want to add something?
That's okay. That's yeah. There's so much to say.
Yes.
Particularly good access to archives that other people didn't have?
She was very lucky in that, yes, probably her sort of aristocratic background gave her people like the person who had Teresa Guiccioli's letters from her family, probably felt that, she wouldn't make a sort of a scandal out of the letters, but she would handle them properly. In that case, yes, it was a real treasure trove finding the letters of Byron and Teresa Guiccioli. And The Merchant of Prato, I think she was lucky. She came upon the archives in Prato of this medieval merchant.
I have a question for any of you who can write, but in the milieu of the Anglo-American community in Florence, she seems, at least from what he heard, that being in Valdorcia, being very concerned with the improvement of the property and the living conditions and the refugees, that she lived a sort of a life of her own with her family, with her husband, with whom she shared all these values, but isolated from the rest of the larger Anglo-American community that was present in Florence. And I was wondering whether if you can say something or...
Well, I know she and Berenson certainly, and she goes to Florence a lot, even in both books, right? Part of the interest of the books is she's in Rome, she's in Florence, she's not, she's often moving around, and so she does seem to keep tabs on on some of these people at least. And I know she and Bernard Berenson.
They were all much older than her.
They were older than her, but she was certainly interested in kept up with him. I don't know who else, but it's not as if she's completely sealed herself off out in the depths of the country.
She has a completely different approach to life and lifestyle. I mean, she's very much chosen to be also Italian, and all the people she met in Florence, it's, as you say very rightly in your book, the Second World War is a bit of a death blow to the Anglo-Florentine colony for several reasons. I mean,
yes.
I'm curious to know whether your grandmother knew Sir Harold Acton, because La Pietra, where this gentleman goes.
Indeed, yes.
Port Michel, and loved to have
It's
some insight.
one of her memories in her. I forgot to add that she wrote a very interesting, fascinating autobiography, which is also interesting because it chronicles her American side of the family. She tells the episode of Harold Acton, who, poor thing, through no fault of his probably, was turned up at one of her birthday parties. They must have been 8 or 9. I'm checking with my mother. About 8 or 9, and he turns up at her birthday party bearing as a present a Fabergé egg. So of course my question was, where's the Fabergé egg? And nobody knows.
A gift from Hortense.
But they did know each other very well. Yes. I think at a certain point their paths, they again led very different lives.
I just wanted to say, as an American, what your grandmother's book meant to me. 30 years ago plus, we bought a little farmhouse right under where Sant'Anna di Stazzema. The cross is there, and it's now a national monument to the resistance, overlooking a little town, Camaiore, Campus Majoras. And the first year at this little farmhouse, I read your grandmother's book. And I can't tell you what it meant as an American. It had such a profound effect. I am so moved by tonight and to meet your mother. And it's extraordinary. So thank you for the gift.
Thank you.
Yeah, this was truly extraordinary, and it's been so interesting to learn about Origo and to read about her perceptions of what was going on during the war, and also to hear all of your questions and how she's touched your lives. So this was very moving, and thank you all for coming. Thank you for coming.